It's a pleasure to welcome back John Robbie. I mentioned to him before that he's now officially the person with the highest number of watch time hours on our channel ever. So no pressure, John, but thanks for that and welcome back.
Thank you very much indeed. The reaction I've had has been terrific. Just two old rugby fans, fanatics chatting about the game, and we drifted all over the place, but most people seem to have loved it and loved some of the stories in particular.
Well, that's the thing about rugby stories now. We all drifted across the entire world at a stage. We tell stories, we have a beer, we enjoy the history and the tapestry, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. I spoke about this briefly last week, Leinster versus Munster, and I noticed 80,000 people for a league game early in the season, and the only time I could ever remember that kind of a crowd almost was when the Bulls played the Stormers, or when the Bulls played the Stormers in South Africa. And I was thinking to myself, maybe there's some similarities here. And I want to maybe, if you don't mind, explain to me why this is such a big game. Where is all this coming from? What's the rivalry like? Give me the history and the tapestry, like I said, please.
Gee, how long have you got?
All day.
I mean, the provinces in Ireland, I think I mentioned it to you before, MV, that Ireland, if you sat down, if God Almighty sat down to design a rugby setup, he couldn't have done it better, or she couldn't have done it better than design Ireland, because it's a fairly small country. It's got 4 provinces. It's got basically 5 cities that play rugby, a wonderful school system, a wonderful club system, from the 4 provinces feeding into one national team. Now, you look at England with all these teams all over the place. You look at France with the teams all over the place. We have, in many ways, too many teams in South Africa when you look at it. We've got a relatively small number of great teams, but Ireland has this absolutely perfect setup for rugby. Now, in the past, Ireland was, it was always a big rugby country, but rugby was very much a junior game to Gaelic football, hurling, and soccer. They were the big games in Ireland. Rugby was, with perhaps the exception of the city of Limerick, it was basically an upper class game. People went to private schools, or traditionally rugby schools if they were government schools. A lot of them went to universities, and they came that way. It was a sort of an elitist game. Now, I'm generalizing to a large degree, but I'm going way, way back. In Dublin, you had Trinity College Dublin. You had a lot of English people who came from the public schools. And of course, in England, public school, believe it or not, means private school. The rich upper classes who go on to become military commanders in the empire. So you got a lot of these who lived in Ireland, who came over and started at the universities in Ireland. And that's where it went. Then when they got their degrees finished, they formed rugby clubs, etc. And the 4 provinces in Ireland, Ulster, Leinster, Munster, and Connacht, always had sort of 4 distinct, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for, characteristics, and again, generalizing. But in Ulster, it was very much a Protestant game, very much an upper-class Protestant game, and they were always very, very skilled, very, very well drilled teams, a lot of class. You got players like Jackie Kyle and Mike Gibson coming through. These were classy players. And of course, a lot of the other teams didn't like Ulster because they were part of Britain. For a long time, they were part of the United Kingdom. So there was sort of politics and all sorts of other stuff tied up in Ulster. And I'd like to think that that's gone. And I know that Irish Rugby is always very proud that the Ulster team, played for Ireland. The players in the Ulster team played for Ireland. Other, different from soccer, where you have a Northern Ireland team and the South, etc. So without getting too political, Ulster always had that particular identity. Then you came back to Leinster, which was based around Dublin. Ulster was based around Belfast mainly, with little sort of strongholds like Ballymena, where Willie John and Sid Miller came from. And then you had places like Derry, where there was a school there called Foyle College, etc. But it was basically around Belfast. Leinster, very much around Dublin. Very, very much around Dublin. The big schools in Dublin, 2 universities in Dublin, strongholds of rugby. And Leinster were traditionally one of the strongest. When Ulster had a strong team, there was always a saying that if Ulster is strong, Ireland will be strong. And over many, many years, that was the case. And I'm talking back through history now. And then you had Munster. Munster was always different. Limerick, which is, how can I say, without being unfair, in many ways is more of a working class city in terms of rugby than any other city. I mean, it's the Limerick teams were always tough. Cork was always a little bit above that. They considered themselves a little bit sort of more, how shall I say, skillful perhaps than physical. But you had these two cities in Munster, that's down the southwest, and a huge rivalry between the two cities, between the clubs. I mean, club rugby in Munster is very, very tough indeed. I mean, as opposed to provincial rugby, which we now call club rugby. So Munster always had, how can I say, this is almost like a cartoon now, a pack of really, really tough forwards. You had backs who could tackle like hell and chase like hell, maybe not as skillful, and always a little fat, round fly half who could control. Think of Mick English, think of Barry McGann, think of Tony Ward. And that was always the sort of traditional side of Munster. They didn't play pretty rugby, but my goodness, they could kick it up in the air, chase it, and cause chaos, particularly against touring teams. I mean, even the famous Gary Owen, the up and under in rugby. There's a bit of a debate whether it was named after a Welsh fly half called Gary Owen or the famous Gary Owen Rugby Club in Duradoyle in Limerick. But nobody in Ireland will believe any of that Welsh nonsense. Gary Owen comes from Ireland, comes from Munster tactics, and they used to have a saying that the crowd down in Munster, when you played Munster, used to say, "Kick ahead, Munster, any head," and to some degree that's the way it was. And then you had the Cinderella province, Connacht in the west, based around, I suppose, definitely Galway and Athlone in the centre, and they were traditionally much weaker. Rugby was very, very much the minor game. And not too long ago, they even tried to disband the Connacht Rugby Union, to make Ireland three provinces instead of four. And the IRFU, this was in the early days of professionalism, hugely underestimated, even though rugby was quite small in Connacht, just the passion surrounding it. And there was actually a protest with thousands of people came to Dublin to march to say, you cannot mess with Connacht rugby. And as I again mentioned to you in our last chat, Mvia, Connacht rugby coming up and now competing with some of the very best teams is one of the great success stories. So that was the sort of the character of each of the provinces. And originally it was built very much around the schools. Schools rugby in Ireland is huge in each of the provinces. Leinster the biggest, Ulster and Munster would come second, and then Connacht. And you get schools like Blackrock College, who've been playing in the schools competition for 150 years and have won it 70 times, 7-0. And you look at some of the greatest players who come through Irish rugby, Fergus Slattery, for example, Brian O'Driscoll in more recent times, Leo Cullen, the coach of Leinster. They all came up through Blackrock, who are huge. And then, of course, you get the occasional little minnow school, and you can see where I'm going with this, like John Robbie from high school, who have won it once in 150 years, and that happened to be our year. But schools rugby is so big that it becomes a launching pad for young, promising players. And I was lucky enough to be one of them. Then, of course, you have the club system, which is very, very strong. Clubs in each of the four provinces, and they used to play provincial competitions, but also friendlies. You travel to play Belfast, a team in Belfast, and it was a friendly. And this, in the old days, was one of the weaknesses of Irish rugby, because you could find yourself, and it happened to me on a number of occasions, you'd be playing against, let's say, a club from Galway, who are traditionally weak. Without breaking sweat, in those days, you win by 30 points. Next week, you could find yourself playing for Ireland against France, against players who'd, for the last 4 weeks, played Toulouse against Toulon, against Narbonne, against Béziers, Welsh who'd played Cardiff and Swansea and Newport and Pontypool. So that was always a weakness of Irish rugby, that the club game was much weaker than the international game. And of course, one of the changes, because of the lucky structure they've had is that they now go from club rugby, which is basically amateur, into contracts playing the provincial rugby, and the standard is very, very high. So when Ireland then play, they're getting from a pool of players who've been playing at a very, very high level, unlike the old days. But there's a wonderful humour still in Irish rugby. I hope it's still in Irish rugby, because I mentioned to you before, I was a little disappointed at the Leinster final when they lost when they lost to La Rochelle. I was at that game. And I was also a little disappointed by some of the behavior of the Irish fans, not all of them, when they lost in Pretoria to South Africa. And you wonder, has one of the, how shall I say, the victims of Ireland and Leinster and provincial success, has it been that wonderful sporting and fun aspect that Irish rugby had? So it's a little a concern I'm putting forward, but hopefully I'm wrong. So I hope that's given you a little bit of the background of rugby there. And as a proud South African and South African rugby supporter now, I get huge a thrill watching Irish rugby, and to watch 80,000 people in Croke Park. When I captained, twice I captained Leinster against Munster, once at the old Lansdowne Road, where we maybe had 8,000 to 9,000 people, once at Thomond Park, which was jam-packed at 7,000 in those days. We thought they were big crowds. I wonder what it's like now.
Yes, I can just imagine. I was about to ask you tell me about your days as captain, because I went to Loftus last year or the year before. I can't remember when it was, beginning of last year, April somewhere, when Leinster came to play in South Africa against the Bulls, and they sent we called it a C team, and the Bulls just whipped them. And I thought, what's this Leinster thing about? And I obviously started realizing, but it wasn't the proper Leinster team. And then the semi-finals of the URC this year, it was almost a test match. And I was thinking, I didn't realize, for example, that you were the captain of Leinster. So, that to me is quite important. It's like you're a captain of the Bulls or captain of the Stormers or Province for that matter. Tell me a bit about that. That I'm quite interested in.
Well, I think I used the expression, and a lot of people have come and had a laugh and said, is it true that nothing about my rugby career was ever straightforward? And I think I said to you also that I was a very good rugby player, but I was never a great player. When I played against the great players, the Andy Irvins of the world, or the Gerald Davises of the world, or the Phil Bennetts of the world, and I think I told you a story about Sid Going, how he nearly took my head off when I thought I absolutely had him. So I was a very, very good player. But I'd like to think, without being immodest, I was a very good captain. I mean, I was a noisy captain, and I was maybe a little bit of a tartar when I was captain, but I had a hugely successful track record. And I'd captained the Leinster under-19 team for 2 years. So I'd captained them when I was a year younger than the rest of the players. And 2 successful years. I'd captained Dublin University to the most successful season they had in 60 years. I captained Cambridge University. We hammered Oxford in the varsity match and played very, very well against the All Blacks in the first game of their tour in 1978. So I was known as a bit of a captain. But because I was traveling over for squad sessions, and also I think, and I'm looking back at it now, as I say, some people would say I was a little bit arrogant, but I would say it was just passion. I was just so passionate. And in those days, I believed that Irish rugby was punching below its weight. We had players as good as the Welsh or French or English or whatever, but maybe we weren't quite as fit. Maybe we weren't quite as organized as they were. And the one thing in my head was I could feel the organization of a successful rugby team. I knew what had to be done, what didn't have to be, what wasn't being done. And then I came over and we played. Leinster had played against Ulster in a shocking game at Lansdowne Road. I think we won 9-6. It was a horrible game. And my dear mate Ollie Campbell had been captain of Leinster. Wonderful player. But I think he went and said to the selectors, look, I'm really not captaincy material. And the Leinster team at that day, we used to play 3 games a year. We used to play against the other provinces. And if you were very lucky, you'd get a touring game. And because as the tours became shorter and shorter, because the test match was always played in Lansdowne Road in Dublin, often Munster and Ulster would get a game against the touring side, and we never did. And there was no great pride in playing for Leinster. Playing for Leinster was almost a necessary evil that you had to go through, hoping to get a final trial to play for the ultimate goal, which was Ireland. So as a result, you play for a Leinster team and the jerseys were lousy. You know, the training sessions were badly organized. We weren't looked after at all. If you stayed in a hotel before a game, the hotels were sort of second standard. And that was sort of the feeling that surrounded the players and Leinster. And I'll never forget, and we went on a wet night to train at Old Belvedere Rugby Club, which is now Ollie Campbell Park. And we walked in and it was wet. And, you know, we knew that Coach Mick Doyle, who went on, the late Mick Doyle, to become a very, very successful coach. But at the time, he just started off and his training sessions were badly organized. You know, you almost felt he was making it up as he went along. And nobody enjoyed the session. Guys had traveled an extra training night. They trained with their clubs Monday and Thursday. This was on a Wednesday night. And Mick Cuddy, who was the president, a very well-known guy, player who played for Leinster many years ago, was deemed to be too thick to captain his club, Bective Rangers, because he was a big, sort of boisterous countryman, which was ironic because he went on to become a multi-millionaire and a hugely successful businessman. He was deemed to be too thick to captain his club. He gave me a punch in the arm and said, we've made you captain for the game against Llanelli, get them going. And I don't know what happened to MV, but I lost my temper. Now, bear in mind, I'm in my early 20s at this stage. I've got a couple of caps for Ireland, but I've never had a great Irish career, but I am a good captain. So he hit me on the shoulder. And for some reason, I lost my temper. Now, Mick Doyle was a British and Irish Lions, 1968, hugely successful vet. The other guy is the president of the Leinster Union, or chairman of the Leinster Union, and I'm this whippersnapper. And I gave them a mouthful. And I think I used the expression, if I'm right, and it just popped into my head at the time. I said, guys, the way things are being run at Leinster, I would rather captain a one-man dinghy than captain Leinster. That popped into my mind, and they were quite shocked. And so I said, you don't tell me I'm captain. You ask me if I'm captain, if I want to be captain. You know, I mean, how could I look back on it now and I'm embarrassed. I'm absolutely shocked at what I said, but it meant so much to me at the time. And I was so angry with this slapdash approach. So I went into the dressing room. I can still remember it. The players were getting ready. They were aware there was a little bit of an altercation outside the dressing room. And bear in mind, you had some wonderful players here. Willie Duggan, Fergus Slattery, Ollie Campbell. These are top Philip Orr, top international players. And suddenly there's this whippersnapper going on. So I said to them, look, I stuck my head in and I said, they've asked me to be captain. I said, I will do it under certain conditions. And if you trust me, guys, I hope we're going to end up with a better Leinster setup. And I went in and for about 40 minutes, I read the riot act to the two Micks, Mick Cuddy and Mick Doyle, and I told them that no one wanted to play for Leinster. They just had to go through this torture in order to play for the final trial and get into the Irish team, and gave them a rocket. And I said, and the jerseys we wear are shocking. It's like them old Spacks. Terrible. How can you expect people to have a pride in that? Anyway, what. I said, if we can sit down, come up with organization in terms of the way the players are looked after, the way we train, the selection that is done, the motivation that's done, the way we're looked after, I said, I will become captain. And again, arrogantly, I suppose, I said, and I will guarantee that Leinster will become a much better organization, etc. So they took a deep breath and looked at each other. And instead of firing me out of the room as they probably should have done, they said, go for it. And I went into the team and I said, look, this is what I've said. This is what's happened. Let's play with this. Let's use this as a strength. And I guarantee we'll be at training on time. When we arrive, we'll be told exactly what the training session is rather than being made up. We will train hard. We'll come up with a great, because we had wonderful players. We had a magnificent team on paper that was underperforming dreadfully. And I remember going to the other two, back to them and saying, right, the players are on board. And there were some of them who maybe weren't quite on board. They thought I was overstepping the mark. But I had a sort of a solid core of people who I think supported what I wanted to do, which was to play wonderful, attractive, expansive rugby. And I went back to them and I said, we're going to beat Llanelli. Llanelli in those days had J.J. Williams, they had Ray Gravel, they had a marvelous team. And as you know, in 1972, a few years earlier, had beaten the All Blacks famously at Stratty Park. And we went out and we beat Llanelli 21-0, which in those days was a huge score and a huge, huge upset. And I'd like to think from that moment on, Leinster then started to think about the province differently, get more games, get better games, etc. But I look back at it now, and funnily enough, Mick Cuddy, the chairman, passed away. He got sick and passed away. And through my mate Ollie Campbell, I passed on an apology for the way I spoke to them that night. And even though he was very, very sick and he was on oxygen, he looked up at Ollie and said, "Tell John, apology accepted." So we went on and had 2 fabulous years. We won the championship 2 years in a row. We played 13 games instead of the 3 we normally had. And apart from losing on tour in Romania, we won 12 out of the 13 games. So I look upon my Leinster career with a lot more fondness than I do looking back on my Irish career. But, oh, gee whiz, I think if I'd known myself in those days, I would have slapped myself.
All right, so things have changed a bit, though. Today, Leinster is dominant, and there's a lot of talk about Leinster maybe being too dominant. How does it work now in terms of Irish rugby controlling the provinces and the likes? Why does it seem like Leinster are the blue-eyed boys of Irish rugby, or is it an incorrect perception of mine?
Well, of course, I've been out of it a long time now, so let me sort of say that before I make any comments. But obviously, I've got friends and so on. I think one of the reasons Leinster has done so well, ironically, is because of the incredible success, the great success that Munster had in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, when the game went professional. You know, as I say, you had, broadly speaking, more upper class, university, professional people playing. That's a huge generalization in Ulster and Leinster than you did in Munster. So when the game went professional, I think it suited the mindset and perhaps the situation of the Munster players more to go professional. Also, you had this passionate club support, and you had somehow Munster edged ahead. They edged ahead of Leinster. And if you remember, they won 2, I think it was Heineken Cups in those days. They've changed so many times, I forget. And Munster were very, very successful. I remember them beating Toulouse in one of the finals, and a massive, massive crowd went over. And I think suddenly, having traditionally been always competitive, but slightly behind Ulster and Leinster, Munster were now ahead. And I think that shocked Leinster. You know, you almost had, they used to jokingly say there are many Lunster, Lunster, supporters in Dublin. Even though they were from Leinster, they secretly were supporting Munster because they were now getting this international success. And then Leinster, I think, got together and said, look, let's do this properly. They got a full-time CEO, a guy called Mick Dawson, who I knew very, very well, played hooker for Lansdowne. And he only just retired, I think last year. And if you read, they did an interview on his retirement. He talked about how when he started off, they had a little porter cabin in the RDS, and they had to try and arrange professional rugby from there, but they did it. And they ended up putting a lot into it. The other thing I said, and I said this to you before, was Irish rugby was lucky, I think, in that a lot of the business people who got involved, because rugby went from being this amateur sport with an amateur attitude into this multi-million-dollar professional sport with highly paid athletes and, you know, world fame, lots of money. And a lot of business people got involved, as they did elsewhere. But I think that the Irish business people were also rugby people as well. So even though a businessman always wants a return on his investment, I mean, that's what business is, I think that rugby was always kept first and foremost ahead. And then, of course, you had Dublin being bigger than any of the other cities, more clubs in Dublin, more schools in Dublin, certainly more spectators in Dublin. And then I think people got on board this great roller coaster that became Leinster rugby. Then, of course, you got some fabulous players. I mean, Brian O'Driscoll being the classic example. And then they bought well. They bought in Contepomi from Argentina. They bought in Rocky Elsom, who I see is now in big legal problems. But that's a different story. And in fact, he was going to do an interview because he had a very successful year with Leinster when they won the championship, the European Championship. And because of the legal situation, they had to cancel his big interview because they felt it simply wouldn't be right. But they brought in these players. They got a level of professionalism. They also, I think, like a lot of people who suddenly, unions suddenly went from being amateur to professional, they overdid it. They had too many people signed on. They had academies that were too big. They were in a little bit of trouble. But luckily, I think the universities have now provided a fabulous breeding ground for professional players as well as amateurs. So if you look at university rugby now, my old university, Dublin University, Trinity College, UCD in Dublin, they have wonderful underage setups where players can come and pick up university degrees, get a good education, and still, if they're good enough, go into the professional game. So you had schools, you had clubs, you had universities, you had good organization in 4 provinces, which is so fabulous to administer. And then the other thing, which I think is, and in fact, one of the commentators, it was Donal Lenihan, that amazing ex-Irish lock forward who just came after me. I was lucky enough to play 1 game against him and 1 game with him when he was a young 20-year-old skinny lock. And I think he was a wonderful player, but I think he's a very, very good commentator. And because Croke Park is the home of Gaelic football, it's not the home of Irish rugby at all. That's Lansdowne Road. And Gaelic football, as I say, is this traditional Irish game along with hurling. And he said a number of these Irish players, Leinster and Munster players, would have grown up dreaming of playing in Croke Park, but they would have dreamt of playing Gaelic games, not rugby. And of course, that was the change. When rugby went professional, Gaelic games stayed amateur. So a lot of these big, strong country boys, bogmen we used to call them, which is a terribly, terribly racist and bad term now. And it's, but I say it in all jest because they call the city guys, they call us Jackeens. So we call them bogmen or culchies. And a lot of those guys who are big and strong and tough, many have grown up in the farming community, and they've grown up with wonderful ball skills because they've played Gaelic football and hurling. You look at a guy like Tig Furlong. I mean, he grew up in County Wexford playing hurling. And he says, great, many would say he is or was the best tight head forward in the world. And do you remember those side steps he threw some years ago, playing for Ireland at top level? So a lot of these guys who in my day would have played Gaelic football are now professional rugby players coming through. As somebody once said, can you imagine Australia if the Aussie rules footballers all were playing rugby? Now the Australians would be better than any other team probably in the world. And that sort of transformation is happening in Ireland at the moment. And the results are there to be seen. I mean, we used to jokingly say that if we won the toss, we did a lap of honor playing for Ireland. And now, of course, they're ranked #1 in the world. Although, as you know, I don't go much by the rankings. It's what you win that counts. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sort of a background to the past, how amateur it was, and now how professional it is. And the big question, of course, is can they win a knockout game in the next World Cup?
All right, John. The thing that I've noticed, I met Leo Cullen here when Leinster played in the semi-final. I was impressed by how tall he is. You just mentioned that Archie and all those guys make him look small, but he made me look small. And I'm not the smallest guy in the world. It's interesting to meet them. But Leo Cullen has been a pivotal figure in the Leinster that we know today. Tell me a bit about him, his background, and what he's done to make Leinster the force that it is today.
All right. Well, remember, I mean, everything I say is what I've picked up because he came well after me. But he's a Wicklow man like myself. There are 32 counties in Ireland, and Wicklow is the one just south of County Dublin. So I only learned recently he's from the same county as I am in Ireland. And when I met him recently in Johannesburg, we talked a little bit about that. But he went to the famous Blackrock College, and he went to his school team was, they reckon, one of the greatest school teams that ever played. They just had no weaknesses. They blew everyone apart. And I'll tell you how good the side was that Brian O'Driscoll couldn't get onto the team. He was a replacement on that particular team. Leo was a big lock forward. Of course, he was a lot more conditioned than he is now. Very, very decent guy. And then when the game sort of went professional, I know he spent some time playing for Leicester in the UK as lock, played many games for Ireland. I don't think went on a Lions tour, was probably very, very close. And then came up through the ranks and has coached the team. He's held in great respect by the players. And I think he's also, Leinster, been very, very clever in terms of bringing in expertise from different countries. Mike Catt, for example, Robin McBride, and then obviously a certain Mr. Nienaber from South Africa. So they've been very clever there in bringing in expertise from different countries. And as we know, a certain Geordie Barrett is going to be in the centre for them in the new year, which will bring another dimension to the Leinster side. But I think he's coming to the end of his spell now, but he will certainly go down as a legend in Leinster rugby, both as a player and a coach, and a very nice guy.
I wanted to ask you about Jacques Nienaber, and I'm glad you raised it. There was an article this past week about how he struggled to communicate with the Irish guys in the beginning. He was a bit blunt, or maybe a bit too Afrikaans, or something didn't gel well there, and they sort of put him to rights there. How well do you think Jacques will fit into this Leinster environment? You know, him and Rassie were at Munster, did it very well there, and that's part of the reason they came back to South Africa. But Jacques at Leinster seems to be a bit of an odd fit to me. Or do you think he's gonna be okay there?
Well, I don't know him, so it's very, very difficult. You're asking me a very, very difficult question there, and then envious. But I think when you come into a setup that is so professional, now, okay, he's won a World Cup as a coach, but I think he's there very much as a specialist in defence. And I thought the Leinster defence was fantastic, particularly in that first half. I said to you the last time we spoke that this rush defence, it takes a while to get there, and I evidenced that with the first time that South Africa used it. England had scored 3 tries in the first 15 minutes at Ellis Park, if you remember, because you've got to get your timing dead right. You've got to come up so quickly that if the team stands so deep that they go round the defence, your cover has got a chance to get across. And we saw a couple of classic examples where Munster beat the Leinster rush defence, but the winger got the ball so deep, the Leinster were able to cover it. And I think that let me put it a different way. If you've got any sense, when you go to a completely different environment, you keep your powder dry. And I remember Gary Teichmann as a good friend of mine, and when he went over to play with Newport, I played for Pontypool, the great Pontypool side, for a while. And even though I told you I was quite chirpy, unusual for a scrum half, you might say, but I was not shy to voice my opinion, particularly on the rugby field and on the training field, etc. As I said, I was considered a good captain. But when I played for Pontypool, I was the outsider. Even though I was a seasoned international rugby player and well-known, and I kept my mouth shut. When I came to Wanderers, when I came to Transvaal, believe it or not, I kept my mouth shut. And I said to Gary Teichmann, can I give you 2 bits of advice? And he said, yes, you can, John. I said, don't live in Newport and keep your mouth shut till you've proved yourself on the field. And he comes to me often and says, thank you very much for that bit of advice. Now, obviously, as a coach, you have to talk. You can't keep your mouth shut. You're there. But Jacques Nienaber is experienced enough to know you don't come in and start to change things. You don't do what Brian Clough tried to do when he became manager of Leeds United in the soccer. And the first meeting he had with the players, he told them they were all rubbish and they were cheats and that they should take all the medals. They've been hugely successful and throw them away. You don't do that. You sit there, you bide your time, you gradually influence and bring things through. Because Leinster are, there's a huge amount of pride in Leinster, and they know they're one of the best teams and one of the best setups in the world. And the last thing they need is somebody from the outside coming them and giving them the time of day. But obviously he's settled well, looking at the way Leinster are playing. And you can obviously see from the motivation that Leinster are up there. They're fed up with losing in finals and semi-finals there. And I think they will recognize that he has a huge role to play. And also, when you look at, again, a classic example, you look at Achia Snyman, the way he changed the line out. And I thought that Donald Lenihan picked that up very, very well in the commentary. Even if he didn't, the Munster had changed their line-out calls. The philosophy of the line-out, Archie gave it to Leinster, and as a result, Leinster were able to disrupt the line-out. So Archie will come with many more tricks from the Springboks, many more ideas, not just to do with defence, which is his main mandate. And gradually, if the players accept him, if he wins their respect, and Leo Cullen and the coaches win their respect, I think you'll see some more of the sort of South African, how shall I say, expertise coming through. For example, again, I always try and back up an opinion with example, that I think Leinster scrumming has gone backwards. I mean, amazingly, the first scrum at the weekend was in the 25th minute, which is unbelievable. I nearly fell off my seat when I did that. But there were a couple of dominant scrums. But when you look at those two props that Leinster have, a couple of years ago, they were being called the best in the world, even better than South Africa. I think Irish scrumming, Leinster scrumming has gone backwards. And I think that you'll see Jacques Nienaber will say, well, hang on a second. Maybe this is one of the reasons that South Africa is so dominant in the set scrums. So what I'm saying is, if he's got sense, and he obviously has, he will gradually just throw a few little ideas into the coaching team, and the team will try it. And if they're successful, they will be adopted, and his stock will go through the roof. But he's a brave move to go over there, because you've got to prove yourself. You've got to get people saying this guy can play. I might add that after a while, when I played for those teams, I did talk a lot, but I always felt I'd sort of prove myself first.
I've got no doubt about you getting, having your say after a while. I'm sure you did. Let's talk about the game then. And what a game it was. First 20 minutes or so, they scored one try after the other. They just dominated Munster. Munster came back a little bit towards the end. But this Leinster seems to, I don't know, they seem to have taken a step up. Like you said, maybe the scrums weren't that good. The lineouts, the attacking, the defence specifically was exceptional. They've taken a bonus point from every single game that they've played this year so far. 4 games, 20 points, 5 points per game. And that says something. And I'm a little bit concerned about how ominous they are. I mean, I'm a Bull supporter, and I've made no secret of that. We also scored 26 points in 20 minutes or something, and then we sort of fell apart. But again, it seems to me, very early in the season, I would love to see the Bulls and Leinster take each other on again, but let's leave that for now. Tell me about the game, what you thought about Leinster's performance on the day, where the shortcomings were, like you said, the scrums, and then Munster staging a bit of a comeback, but outclassed on the day. What was the difference between the teams?
All right, well, you've sort of covered a fair bit yourself there. And first of all, the speed of the game was extraordinary. I think I mentioned to you before something that a lot of people are now giving me credit for, but it's not my explanation of the game. The 2 Ps, panic and petrol. Yeah. All right. So you had the petrol was being used up on both sides, because the amount of movement, the physical commitment, the running back, running forward, etc., what was extraordinary. So obviously the game was going to break open. But I thought Leinster, the panic that they created, forget the petrol, because the effect of that comes in a little bit later during the game. For example, the try, whereas they used to take one man standing out, bash, one man standing out, bash. Now you notice teams are playing 2 passes, a skip pass, which again opens things up. It's not, because the defense, as you go further out from the set piece or the ruck, is looser. So they're moving that out, and of course it also is harder to defend against. And then we saw them do bang, bang, they bash away at the line, and then suddenly the scrum halves, both scrum halves did it, make that decision to throw the long pass. And when you've sucked people in with 2, 3, 4 crashes at the line, then that long pass is almost impossible to defend against. It's a very, very tough pass to make. But, we saw it done successfully. Also, Hugo Keenan for his try. It amazes me in rugby now and we've spoken about how you end up with these thin lines in defense, these thin lines facing each other, almost like 2 armies in Waterloo or something like that. But still, if you straighten that line and you bring a man in hitting that line, even if it's slightly against the grain, you can actually cause a real burst into that line. And I love that Hugo Keenan try where they bashed, they crashed, they did something, and then they popped it to him, hitting the line, and he went through without a hand being laid on him. At that stage, I thought Leinster were going to win by 60. They looked so far ahead. And then if you look at Munster, Munster obviously said, by playing the way we're playing, we're not going to win. And they brought in a subtle change. They started to, very unusual for Munster, offload very quickly. In other words, the Leinster tacklers are coming up with that rush defense, totally organized. Suddenly there's an offload, which changes the action. And a couple of times we saw Munster 2 or 3 almost basketball-like passes, quick passes, and very nearly got the guy away, you know? And the other thing was the kick passing from Munster, where they dropped the ball in behind. A couple of times they very, very nearly got it. So I thought, and the Prendergast, the Munster coach, when they had a comment with the coach, he said, we've just got to keep calm. Do what we're doing and keep calm. But the one thing that really let Munster down was not taking your points. Kitch Christie, I chatted to Ray Mort recently, and he said Kitch Christie, wonderful coach, very, very dry, dour man, mostly to do with rugby. I mean, a lovely man, but had a dry, he was one of those guys you wouldn't sort of rush to sit beside on a bus going to a game. But he had some simple set moves. And he said, in our 25, 22 nowadays, you kick it out unless there's a clear overlap. In their 22, you take your points. And Munster missing those 2 kicks, they could have been 21-12 down at halftime. Instead, they were 26-5. And if you think the way the second half went, where, you know, Leinster maybe took their foot off the gas a little bit, but Munster certainly upped their game, that game could have been much closer. So even though it goes down as a big, big win for Leinster, I think they'll be very, very worried, because one of the trends over the last couple of years, think of that final against La Rochelle in Lansdowne Road, where Leinster also scored 3 tries. That wonderful try around the front of the line out with Sheehan, the hooker, running and scoring in the corner. And a trend seems to be that they go ahead and then they can't see it through in the second half. They get worn down. And of course, that trend is now continued. I'm now looking very, very critically at a good win for Leinster. But I would be very worried that they didn't score in the second half. And equally, if Munster had kicked those 2 kicks at goal, by the way, the place kicking was shocking in the game. You know, the one thing that's come through now is that, I mean, I think that any kick within 20 meters of the post and maybe 30 meters out, they should actually give it like a penalty try. You give the point, because they so rarely miss. But the kicking, surprisingly, for 2 good kicking teams, I thought was very, very poor. So a couple of little things will be worrying. Also, of course, Leinster have a big problem at hooker. They've got injuries coming through at hooker, which will be a worry for them. But overall, if you'd offered them that win before the game, they would have taken it. But again, what a game of rugby. You know, what a game in front of 80,000 people, the 3rd biggest stadium in Europe, a magnificent stadium, and one that's so full of history. I mean, such a wonderful game played in such an iconic stadium. And it's amazing because, you know, a few years ago, when Lansdowne Road was being redeveloped, and suddenly games were being played in Croke Park, and rugby people were coming to me in South Africa and elsewhere saying, what on earth is Croke Park? Well, Croke Park is part of Irish history. It was a stadium that the GAA, which is this incredible body, this amateur sporting body that runs Gaelic football and hurling and the girls' equivalent, and is very much tied with Irish politics as well, Irish church as well. These were the Irish traditional sports. When Ireland was looking for independence, and sports like cricket and rugby and soccer, for many people, were seen as foreign games. And the home ground was Croke Park, named after an archbishop who was one of the founding members of the GAA. And going back into the really bloody history of Ireland now, you had a rebellion in 1916. You had a war of independence where terrible things were done on both sides. Michael Collins was the Irish leader, if you remember that famous movie with Liam Neeson. Then you had an agreement which agreed for Irish basically independence, but without the north of Ireland, which led to a bloody civil war. So Ireland has got a very, very bloody, even recent history. And on a terrible day, known as Bloody Sunday, it was a Sunday in, I think, 1920, during the War of Independence, Michael Collins had a squad, a hit squad, and there was a group of British spies in Dublin, and they were known as the Cairo Gang. And this hit squad went and murdered all of these British spies. And the Black and Tans, who were this terribly, terribly undisciplined group of English ex-soldiers, ex-servicemen from the First World War who did terrible, terrible things in Ireland. To take revenge, they went into a football match at Croke Park and they fired into the crowd and murdered 14 people. So Croke Park has got a really serious history. Hill 16, that small end of Croke Park, supposedly was built on the rubble from the Irish Revolution, all the buildings that were destroyed. So there's massive history and massive emotion tied to Croke Park. And of course, it was never allowed to host rugby or soccer or any other foreign game. And then when Ireland, the Irish Rugby redeveloped Lansdowne Road, a very good friend of mine, Peter Boyle, who I was at school and university with, subsequently was president of the IRFU. And he went to the GAA and said, how about us playing rugby there? Now, that is just unheard of in the day. But they had progressive people who talked, and they talked about things changing. And if you remember the day that Ireland played France, and then particularly Ireland played England at Croke Park. I mean, it was just, for me, it was almost like a South African having a Mandela moment. You know, most South Africans never thought they'd live to see Nelson Mandela getting released. Well, I never thought I'd live to see rugby being played at Croke Park. And then a couple of years later, when the Queen of England visited Ireland and went to Croke Park, obviously because of very, very emotional moments, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. So Croke Park is not just a wonderful rugby stadium, it is a very, very spiritual place. And interestingly, the Leinster team before the game actually had a historical talk. They had a historian who came in before they played Munster at Croke Park to say, guys, do you realize you're playing on holy ground now? Yeah. And as Donald Lenihan said, a lot of the young players from both sides would have dreamt of playing at Croke Park, but dreamt of playing Gaelic football or hurling. So for me, the fact it's being used for rugby is such a magnificent stadium, is such a good news story. And like South Africa, you know, Ireland's had its fair share of bad news stories recently. And that's a good news story. So just, and if people Google Croke, C-R-O-K-E, Croke Park, it is an amazing, amazing story.
Oh, all right. Talking about goosebumps. John, one thing I wanted to ask you about Croke Park. 82,000 people, I think you said. What is Gaelic football and what is hurling? I mean, I've got absolutely no idea what it is. So how can it attract 82,000 people? How can it be so big? Just in briefly tell me what these sports are.
The two traditional games, hurling goes back hundreds of years, which is a country game played. It's almost like hockey in the air, if I can put it that way. And it's the fastest field sport in the world and massively, massively skillful. And they played on the same pitch as Gaelic football, which is a game from which Aussie rules developed. You know, Aussie rules became, cricket teams needed to do something out of season. So they started a game based on Irish Gaelic football, where you can bounce the ball, you can hop it up to yourself, you can pass it and kick it to players. It's got a soccer goal with goalposts, if you like, extending like rugby. You kick it over the bar or hit it over the bar in hurling. It's 1 point. You score it into the net, it's 3 points. Every county has a team, and they play in different divisions until it goes through what they call the All-Ireland Final. And the All-Ireland Final is where the two top county teams play in Gaelic football and in hurling, and you cannot get a ticket for love nor money. It's one of the great occasions in Irish and world sport. And believe it or not, they've shown it recently on BBC television in England and also in America, where, of course, there's a large ex-Irish population. And if you go on YouTube and ask for Americans and British reaction to Gaelic football, but particularly hurling, because it is such an incredible game, the reaction is extraordinary. And of course, Gaelic, and of course, Croke Park is the home of both of those sports.
A friend of mine that I talked to, Harry Jones, on this channel as well, he went to one of those games. He said it was the most confusing game of sports he's ever watched. He had no idea but it was wonderful. He had no idea what's going on. He loved it.
It's not confusing at all because there's so very few rules and it just goes on and continues. And as I say, tide furling, believe it or not, who's such a big, strong guy, was a top-class junior hurler. And you know the golfer Lowry, his father won an All-Ireland hurling medal. So Lowry, who's won the US Open and the British Open, he goes home to Tipperary, and he's okay. They love him, but compared to his dad, he's nobody. He's only won majors in golf. His dad won an All-Ireland hurling medal.
Yes. Right, John. One more thing. We talked about Ronnie Dawson. Just tell us a bit about him. You had a good analogy that he was Ireland's Dr. Donny Craven. That will put it into context. Tell us about him and what happened.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking probably because the commentators at one stage mentioned the late Ronnie Dawson, who just passed away. Yeah, Ronnie Dawson was Ireland's equivalent of Donny Craven. He was a hooker. He captained Leinster. He captained Ireland, and then he led the British and Irish Lions to New Zealand in 1959, which was one of the happiest tours they've ever had. They should have beaten the All Blacks. Don Clark kicked all the goals, and they scored all the tries with Tony O'Reilly and you know, people of that ilk. Then he went and became an administrator. He became a coach to Ireland, the first coach that Ireland ever had. He coached the Lions in 1968 to South Africa, which was also a hugely happy tour. I think they've had 15 reunions of that Lions team. My Lions team in 1980 has had 0. I'm ashamed to say, because you've got to have a couple of guys who really want to arrange those reunions. He was a strange man, a very serious man, but had a good sense of humor as well. Very much against the game going professional. He believed that you had a professional attitude to the game on the pitch, but shouldn't get paid for it. So he would have fought very hard against the game going professional. But underneath a slightly severe exterior, he had a heart of gold. And I know, because I remember when, I think I mentioned, I broke my leg playing for Ireland against France. And I was at university in England. And even though I was having a wonderful time playing for Cambridge, I was at a low level with Ireland because I was out of the scene. Colin Patterson had come on board, brilliant scrum half, my nemesis in many ways. And I didn't know Ronnie Dawson very well. I mean, I knew him because my father-in-law worked in the Bank of Ireland, and Ronnie Dawson, for his whole career, was the architect for the Bank of Ireland, their offices and branches and so on. And I remember getting this letter written in the most beautiful script, almost sort of medieval monkish script, typical of an architect. And it just said, "Dear John, just a note, Ronnie Dawson here, etc. Wada. And he said, the gist of it was, I know you're probably feeling a bit down now about your place in Irish rugby. Just to tell you, you're not forgotten. We're keeping an eye on you. Play well, continue, come back, play games whenever you can, etc." And he said, your time will come again. And then he had obviously watched the varsity match where I'd had a very good game, and he praised me about that, came up with a couple of suggestions and so on. And I'll never forget, it was the first time I really understood that when you're on top, whether it's sport or business or life, everybody wants to be a friend. Everybody wants to slap you on the back. But it's when you're down, and I was really at a low in terms of Ireland rugby at that stage. You know, I got that letter and I realized those are the special people. Those are the special people who give you that lift up when you're down. And Alfred Ronald Dawson, one of the fittest men I ever knew, he would still run miles and run himself into the ground when he was in his 60s and 70s, would do that when we were training. And he died age 94. He was a really true, great servant of the rugby game. And yeah, I'm proud to have called him a friend.
Right, John, thanks for that. Part of the reason I'm trying to understand what's happening in Irish rugby is because Ireland is now our new rivals / friends. And we need to understand it, but then there's a bit of rivalry going on. We talked about it last time. Who is now the #1 team in the world? Ireland's #1 in the rankings. At the end of November, after the end of year tours, we'll know who the real #1 team in the world is. And I thought it'd be a good idea to get to understand your enemy.
But we're not playing Ireland, are we? We played them, and we sort of drew.
The points that you guys accrued, Ireland accrues, and then what South Africa accrues is going to determine who's going to be the #1 team at the end of the year tour. So it's such a pity that we're not playing against Ireland.
Yeah.
But still, the points will determine.
It's a lovely one because I'm in this unique situation where, having grown up Ireland, been Ireland, had a name in Ireland. Now I'm suddenly the opposite. I'm Springbok #1 supporter, and it pisses off a lot of my friends. But you know, it's not a put on thing. That's just the way I feel. But yeah, no, you fire ahead with that one.
All right. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Next time we'll have another chat about one of the other provinces. I love to hear the stories and the things that happen behind the scene in the history. Like I said, that makes it so much more enjoyable, if that's the right word.